I'll just tell you the best way to start healing. Meditation, yoga, and therapy. They do wonders. Get started on meditation and yoga today. The next most important thing. Keep trying stuff until something works. Just keep going. Don't ever give up. What I'm getting into here is not about my personal trauma. Around August 2021, I started learning a lot about trauma. I've listened to quite a few audiobooks, the first being The Body Keeps the Score, which is highly recommended in the field of trauma therapy. That led me to other researchers, more books, and YouTube videos. So what follows is a list of resources and my notes on each. I'll be reading my notes to get across accurate information. So this is less extemporaneous, a little bit unlike my other videos. And who knows, maybe better, we'll see. Obviously, this is not my field. I'm a layman. This is not medical advice. I don't have any degrees or anything really in this field. So please seek out a licensed practitioner. But I feel like that's also a really interesting perspective. One that I wanted to hear from people is, maybe they're not an expert and they're not trained, but it's like when you're getting into this stuff, what should you start reading? So here's my list and here are my notes. If you could please do me a favor and look at my subscriber count, and if it's under 1,000, could you please consider subscribing? I'd need 1,000 subscribers to monetize, so if you could subscribe, that would help out a lot. I'd also greatly appreciate a like and a share. Thanks so much. The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. This guy grew up with a family traumatized by war. He was always trying to understand the strange reactions of his family members. That led him to work in trauma, and he worked with U.S. war veterans. He has a perspective on trauma as a dislodged memory. So an episodic memory, an autobiographical memory, has a beginning, middle, and end. Traumatic memory is stuck. It's outside of our normal memory. According to the author, the two most important phrases in trauma therapy are notice that and what happens next. So it's notice that, thought, feeling, or sensation, and it's what happens next. You continue the story. So this comes up a lot in these trauma books, and it's called the triune brain hypothesis. It's the idea that there's three parts to the brain. Doing some more background research on Wikipedia, this says that it's actually false. It was a hypothesis, but it's so widespread now, and it's just useful to talk about. But there's three parts to the brain. They say there's the reptilian brain, the limbic brain, and the neocortex. They evolved at different levels. And the reptilian brain is where reptiles, which we originally evolved from. So that's the sympathetic nervous system. It's the fight or flight response. So the reptilian brain is kind of like your amygdala, which is this almond-shaped part of the brain that is supposed to assess danger and threat. The next level up is the emotional brain, the limbic brain. And this is where it's the brain is trying to integrate all these bodily sensations, take in cues from the environment, and gives us emotions and feeling. And then there's the neocortex. And it's neo because this is the newest part of the brain. It's most recently evolved in human beings. But it's kind of like the outer layer, the front of the brain, that helps us to integrate our experiences and come to a decision. And it also helps with our judgment. Unfortunately, the neocortex shuts down with intense reptilian or limbic activity. So when you have a strong sensation to fight or run away, or when there's a very intense emotion, then the neocortex, it doesn't function properly. And we're unable to integrate the experience. So trauma replays over and over. Trauma can actually make the brain function as if it's had a leisure or stroke. So in order to get back in regulation, there's top-down regulation or bottom-up regulation. Top-down is our brain trying to control our body. Bottom-up is us changing our body to try to affect our brain and our mind. So top-down regulation are things like meditation and yoga. Bottom-up regulation are things like breath work, movement, touch, These all help to recalibrate our autonomic nervous system. Trauma is the ultimate feeling of, this will last forever. There's 3 levels of safety, and that determines our response. So we're focused if we have social engagement, if we can talk to people, see people. Then comes fight or flight, when this isn't available. Do we just fight or run away from the threat? And when there's an overwhelm, when none of those reactions work, we go to freezing. We actually see these responses developing in our study of animals. Way back when organisms first evolved bones, that's when they had a freezing response. At the reptilian level is the sympathetic nervous system response of fight or flight. Lizards can fight or run away. At the mammalian level, we get the emotional brain. We also have social engagement with the vagal nerve going to cranial nerves, affecting facial expression and voice. This is the parasympathetic nervous system. So that's why emotions can change the way you express your face, but also your tone. This nerve is running up all over. Under normal conditions, the rational and emotional brain work together to integrate experiences into memory. The critical factor is the level of arousal. When we are highly aroused by horror and shock, this memory system breaks down. The emotional brain takes over and the rational brain shuts down. This is the hippocampus and the thalamus, which don't function properly. One way I've heard it explained is that the hippocampus actually stamps memories with a date time, and that tells your brain where it's supposed to be in your memory. But this is one of the reasons why trauma can seem like a dislodged memory, and why it replays over and over, is the hippocampus shuts down and it doesn't stamp that memory as in the past. So that's why it can replay over and over. There's also talk of dissociation. So if you dissociate through a traumatic experience, it typically increases the negative symptoms of PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. And dissociation, just try to think of it as separating from the experience. It's when you're trying to push a sensation or a feeling or the thought out of your mind, out of your conscious awareness. So maybe you're focusing on something else and you push your consciousness over to that. What's occurring during the traumatic event is still happening. Your body is still experiencing it. But dissociation, separating from the traumatic experience while it's happening, it tends to make worse symptoms. So what needs to happen is that traumatic memory needs to be associated, integrated into autobiographical memory. So that was then, this is now. There's a lot of ways of healing, breath work, chanting, movement, all very useful. Rhythm is very helpful. We need to learn to recognize and tolerate sensations before revisiting the past. So this is a huge danger point. You can get re-traumatized if you're unable to handle sensations. So we have to increase our bodily tolerance, increase our awareness of it. The mind, the brain, and the body need to feel safe to let go of trauma. The best resilience to trauma is a safe social network. People whom you trust that you can socially engage with. Some useful things can be like healing through fighting and theater. Now, fighting is in the sense of you're working out a fight response, but you're doing it with a sparring partner, which you get a rhythm with, and you also see social engagement there. And that can be one way to work out those sensations, those feelings. And then theater is actually acting out some of these extreme feelings and emotions, but you're doing it with other community members. So this can be really helpful too. So we can also see why trauma from caregivers or intimate partners is extra difficult. It not only hurts you in a way that you thought you were safe, but it also undercuts what you would need to be resilient, which is a safe social network. Managing negative feelings by yourself gives rise to common problems. So this could be dissociation, despair, addictions, chronic panic, and alienation. Symptoms of PTSD are statements like, I feel dead inside. I will never be able to feel normal emotions again. I've permanently changed for the worse. I feel like an object, not a person. I have no future. I feel like I don't know myself anymore. Chronic dissociation from our bodies can make us feel like nobody, or somebody else when we're that disconnected. Now, in the book, there's an entire chapter on yoga. Yoga helps to tolerate your bodily sensations for what they are in the moment, with a beginning, middle, and end. Traumatized people have a sympathetic, the fight or flight, and parasympathetic, rest and digest, calming nervous systems out of sync. So the sympathetic is trying to get you to go up, the parasympathetic is trying to get you to come down, and normally they work in harmony together, but in traumatized people these can be out of sync. Yoga can help to recalibrate that. So as for this book, overall, I would say it gives an excellent overview of trauma and so many treatments. It also exposes you to a lot of traumatic stories, but at the same time, stories of recovery as well, which are uplifting. So this would be a great book to start with. Yoga. It's really helped me so much. Yoga helps get you back in touch with your body while increasing your level of tolerance of bodily sensations. If you have any mental blocks stopping you from doing yoga, get over it. I've felt better after every yoga session so far. Get started for free right now by following Yoga with Adrienne. She has millions of followers for her free yoga sessions. That's mainly what I've been doing, and yeah, it's awesome. She only has one video specifically for trauma-sensitive yoga, but there's a ton of great videos there. There's yoga for any physical ability, including people who are disabled. So even if you're in a chair or bed, you can do yoga nidra. That's N-I-D-R-A. And that works for just about everyone with big benefits. There was one book on yoga I read, and it was actually awesome. This book is Teaching Trauma-Sensitive Yoga, A Practical Guide by Brendan Abram. Even after listening to quite a few books on trauma, I found the description of trauma and the path to healing in this book particularly concise and well explained. Plus, this book is free. Even if you have no money, this is a good place to start. It's a PDF free online. You should be able to find it. Brendan Abram is a 30-year-old veteran of the Canadian Forces and recovering alcoholic. He helped to treat other veterans with trauma. So this is a quote: "It is the basic principles of yoga that bring power to the practice. Breath, mindful movement, focused awareness, and acceptance of the present moment experience are the foundations of any yoga offering." So I was really looking for a perfect yoga style, like what's going to be the best to heal trauma. He argues there's no perfect yoga style for everyone at all times. Each style have their own benefits. Trauma is a stressor or crisis which moves us away from homeostasis, a state of physiological, emotional, or cognitive balance. That's homeostasis. So trauma is about a perceived life-threatening or life-altering event. It is not the objective event that is traumatizing, but our subjective experience of the event. So trauma is dysregulating. The two systems of the nervous system which generate energy and calm us to rest and digest are sending mixed and clashing signals. They're really not working in sync. A standard model of healing trauma is in 3 stages. Stage 1, safety and stabilization, overcoming dysregulation. Understanding trauma and symptoms, finding safety in one's body and environment, finding stability emotionally and being grounded in the present. Yoga is particularly helpful at stage 1 of this healing process. Stage 2 is recalling traumatic memories. And yoga is helpful in building acceptance of the present sensations. Stage 3 is reconnection, integration, and moving on. If trauma is stored in the limbic brain, the rational brain will have less access to it simply thinking through the trauma. This is like talk therapy. It's part of why we can unemotionally describe what happened to us, but not move on. This is the basis for healing through the body, bottom-up regulation. So, trauma-sensitive yoga criteria. This is a bottom-up approach, working from the body up. Be consistent with the accepted stages of trauma recovery. Be needs-based. be adaptive versus prescriptive, and maintain a physical focus. Employ appropriate styles and poses, and place special importance on breath. So we talked about how breath is that, and movement are that bottom-up regulation, and then being adaptive versus being prescriptive is giving the yoga practitioners choices in the poses. So you never want to say, do this exactly, but having options. So here's a trauma-sensitive yoga approach to any pose. Start simple, small steps. Explore, experience, accept, don't expect. It's important, again, to feel you have a choice in each movement. So highly recommend that work and just yoga in general. Incredibly helpful. And it's going to really increase your tolerance of bodily sensations. So the second big name in trauma is Dr. Peter Levine. Somatic Experiencing. Levine systematized a bottom-up, body-based approach to healing trauma. It's rooted in biology and ethology, which is the study of animal behavior, and the healing process is based on what animals go through in the wild. Animals routinely face life and death situations, yet are able to return to functionality. So it's really studying those processes. How do they return to that? Now, I ended up listening to 3 books by Dr. Levine. So Waking the Tiger, Trauma and Memory, and In an Unspoken Voice. The final book being a summary of his decades of practice. Many of us never want to re-experience the trauma we went through. We have that feeling in us that says never again. We don't want to relive it or ever have to work through it consciously. Somatic experiencing offers some hope in that we work directly with sensations in the present moment. Dr. Levine gives the Greek myth of Medusa. Medusa had snakes for hair with a look that would turn any person to stone. The hero Perseus had to defeat Medusa without directly looking at her. He used a shield to see her through the reflection and slay her. The analogy, of course, is that Medusa is the trauma, which causes us to freeze in terror. Notice we're turning to stone. We don't have to face our trauma directly. We can use the mirror of our bodily sensations in the present and release our trauma. A big difference as well is, unlike the standard model of 3 stages of healing for most therapies, Levine offers 9 stages of healing. This is a short excerpt of In an Unspoken Voice, which is the section on paralysis to transformation in chapter 5, should be around page 74. Peter Levine writes, when working with traumatic reactions such as states of intense fear, somatic experiencing provides therapists with 9 building blocks. These basic tools for renegotiating and transforming trauma are not linear, rigid, or unidirectional. Instead, in therapy sessions, these steps are intertwined and dependent upon one another and may be accessed repeatedly and in any order. However, if this process is to be built on firm ground, steps 1, 2, and 3 must occur first and must follow sequentially. So this is with the help of a somatic experiencing therapist, typically not done on your own, because they need to be able to read your body language, see where you're at. Are you overstimulated or understimulated? And they need to really balance you. But it's interesting to note what this process is. So step 1, establish an environment of relative safety. So again, needing to feel safe in body and mind. Step 2, support initial exploration and acceptance of sensation. So what are you feeling? Step 3 is establish pendulation and containment, the innate power of rhythm. So pendulation is a word that he created. It's really like thinking of a pendulum, just a weight on the end of a rope, and it's swinging across to both sides. It's really about going from a feeling of safety over to the feeling of the traumatic sensation, and you're swinging back and forth. And almost like that pendulum will lose some force as it swings to each side. That's kind of what we're doing with this traumatic stored energy. You're slowly releasing it through pendulation, but it's not not staying in the traumatic sensation to get so overwhelmed and re-traumatized. It's just kind of like dipping your toe in, just getting a little bit of that energy. And that step 4 is using titration to increase stability, resilience, and organization. So titration is another word that he made up, but it's about carefully touching into the smallest drop of survival-based arousal and other difficult sensations to prevent re-traumatization. So we can get overwhelmed again. Step 5 is provide a corrective experience by supplanting the passive responses of collapse and helplessness with active, empowered defensive responses. So typically, what he's found is that trauma often comes from not reacting appropriately, being thwarted, not being frozen, and not going through with the responses that you wanted to do. So it sounds a little strange, but it's like you kind of go back there and it's what did your body want to do? What did you want to work out? So, but step 6 is to separate or uncouple that conditioned association that we had of fear and helplessness at that time. And that was normally time limited, but now maladaptive, biological immobility response. So we associated being immobilized with being afraid or other negative emotionality. We really got to separate those two. Step 7 is resolve hyperarousal states by gently guiding the discharge and redistribution of that vast survival energy mobilized for life-preserving action while freeing that energy to support higher level brain functioning. There's just a ton of massive energy welled up inside of you that needs to get slowly and safely discharged. And so step 8 is engage self-regulation to restore dynamic equilibrium and relaxed alertness. So this is a big understanding. It's like how animals are very in tune with their environment. We're supposed to be able to see a threat, assess it, and understand levels of safety. Where when we're normally dysregulated, it can feel like we're in danger all the time. But really being dynamically, just actively in tune with the environment appropriately. So that final step, step 9, is to orient to the here and now, contact the environment, and reestablish the capacity for social engagement. So that's just really big key there. So being present in the here and now. Critical to healing is the idea of felt sense, which is the totality of sensation. This is another thing that Dr. Devine introduced, which is very interesting. So the felt sense blends information to tell us where and how we are. A sensation is like a pixel on a screen, but the image is like our overall felt sense. Or like how we appreciate a song but don't focus on each note. In healing, we switch from individual sensations to the felt sense in a kind of gestalt foreground and background. So developing the felt sense is the first step in healing trauma. It's the source of well-being and creativity, what the organism has to say. So there's a lot there, and this is really key, and this is something that you can start to develop on your own. But it's an interesting idea. Okay, so we have an individual sensation, and then we have the overall feeling of what we're feeling. And it's almost like down to what do you feel in the palm of your hand, or you could say wherever that trauma was, and then what do you feel overall? How's your body doing? And really being able to switch between that. It's like they said, foreground, background, single sensation, overall sensation. Trauma is often encapsulated in our minds by rage and terror. So we have that memory, but what's blocking it off is feelings of rage and terror. And rage is overwhelming anger. Terror is overwhelming fear. We can become immobilized, frozen by these powerful feelings. This is a part of why we get stuck in trauma. We associate freezing with rage or terror. We don't like these feelings, and as we tap into them again, they can overwhelm us, causing us to further freeze and fall further into rage and terror. To avoid this, We can dissociate or disconnect from those feelings, but to heal, we need to go through the immobility to complete the natural process and release the stored up energy. As we face a life-threatening event, our bodies generate as much energy as it can to survive. We fight or run for our lives. If we feel overwhelmed or trapped, our bodies do the opposite and tell us to freeze. It might not seem like the best survival strategy, but freezing has helped us and our ancestors survive. Freezing goes back to when animals evolved bones. However, freezing creates a turbulent tornado of energy. You can see a lot of examples of animals surviving due to the freeze response, but really just think about that. It's creating a turbulent tornado of energy. There's two processes that are in conflict at a really intense time in our lives. So one analogy to think about is driving. We teach people to drive with one foot for a reason. So you could use one foot for the gas and one foot for brakes, so you've got both of them on there. But what happens when you're faced with a sudden accident? People who drive with both feet stomp on the gas and the brakes. So they use both their feet and stomp. And the brakes now have to stop the momentum of the car and work against the engine, which is trying to go full throttle. So does that make sense? So we say to people, don't use this leg, use this one, because when you stomp down, you're only using one leg to stomp down and your brain will go to the brakes. But if you use both feet, it's dangerous. So when you're stuck in freeze, it's like driving with your emergency brake on. You have to work harder to go at the same speed. When you're stuck in fight or flight, it's like you have worn brakes. You go too fast and have trouble slowing down. And it's those two competing systems. But that's it for the car analogy. I hope you can see why these competing energies to stop each other can impede release. If we can move through immobility, complete the defensive response that our body readied, then we can return to dynamic equilibrium, which is orienting to the environment with inquiry and reaction. There's 4 components to trauma reactions: hyperarousal, constriction, dissociation, and the freezing, immobility, helplessness response. So hyperarousal is that fight response. That's where typically the fight response, that's where our sympathetic nervous system is raising as much energy and it's all going to our muscles to act. And then constriction is really like when, you can think of a pupil constricting. It's when we're blocking out the environment to focus on the threat and try to deal with it. So all of our energy is going to focus on the threat. Typically there's a tightening of the muscles as if we're preparing to take a blow. So as we're about to get hit and we got to tense up. And then there's dissociation, which is really just like separating from the event. It's overwhelming, it's too much. Again, we're like pushing that sensation out of our conscious awareness and we're not being fully present with it. And then there's the freezing, immobility, helplessness response, where we actually just are shutting down. And we feel like there's nothing we can do. We just have to hope to get past this event if we survive. So traumatic symptoms develop from these 4 reactions. Our symptoms that we experience, the symptoms that we have afterwards, of PTSD-like symptoms, they're like a release valve that lets out just enough energy for us to continue to function. So freeze is like a circuit breaker that shuts us down before we explode with too much energy. So you can think about the symptoms and the things that we're experiencing, or like the tics that we have. It's like we've got all this energy built up, and if we just let out that symptom for a little bit, then our body can, just get out enough energy to continue on. The human mind is a double-edged sword for trauma and pain. Our neocortex can reach back and communicate with our reptilian brain. And we can rationally understand we are not in danger and quiet our instincts. But it is this control which causes so much trauma. Our rational brain can stop instinctual release of life-saving energy, preventing us from fully exiting the trauma process and entering stages of healing. So does that make sense? It's kind of like, we have this great way to make better decisions and really have a lot of self-control, but at the same time, that ability to stop ourselves prevents us from fully going through these planned survival strategies. Talking about the second book, Trauma and Memory, traumatic memory is not reconstructed like normal memory. Finding a source for trauma, even fictional memories, provides a cocktail of powerful neurotransmitters, adrenaline, and opioids. So it's really interesting. It's like your normal memory can be reconstructed. Of course, it's not exact, and that's typically okay, but traumatic memory is really different. So he goes on to describe the types of memory that we have, and we can see how trauma starts to have an interplay with all of these. So there's two major types of memory, explicit and implicit. And then explicit is conscious and implicit is unconscious. And they have distinct brain structures and functions. They each have two subcategories. Okay, so there's two major types and there's two major subtypes within those. So explicit memory is made up of declarative and episodic. Declarative memory is things you can say, it's facts, it's discrete pieces of memory, rarely therapeutically relevant. Episodic memory is about your life. It's warm and textured, feeling positive, negative values, coherent narratives and stories, autobiographical, spontaneous. Implicit memory is emotional and procedural. So implicit memory can't be called up deliberately. It arises as a collage of sensations, emotions, and procedures. These memories occur outside of conscious awareness. So emotional instincts shared by all mammals are surprise, fear, anger, disgust, and joy. The function of emotional memory are meant to flag a memory with emotional value. And emotions are experienced as physical sensations. Procedures are also called action patterns, have three categories. So there's learned motor actions, like skills, and then there's fixed action patterns, which are hardwired instincts. This could be, bracing, contraction, fight, flight, freezing, and related to territory as well. And then, of course, there's fundamental organismic response tendencies of approach avoidance and attraction repulsion. We have a biological drive to search our procedural memory for actions that helped neutralize threats. So that sounds like it makes sense, right? It's like when you're faced with a threat, your brain is looking in the back of its memory and saying, what did I do before to get me out of this? And that's also how traumatic responses can start to become ingrained, because it's really about how many times did that work. So here in this work, he gives 6 steps to renegotiating a traumatic memory. So step 1 is a here and now experience of relative calm presence, power, and grounding. Step 2 is to gradually shift back and forth between positive grounding sensations and negative traumatic sensations. The traumatic procedural memory appears in its truncated, thwarted form. And during the step, we had something that we wanted to do and it's kind of stuck and it's maladaptive. It's interfering with our daily life now. We really need to track that down with our own bodily sensation. And this is a critical step for a therapist because you want to check if under or over activated. So are you hyper aroused or are you hypo aroused? Are you too far numb to this experience? Because you really need to find that balance. And if you are, then you need to return to step 1 or 2. So step 4, though, is having accessed a snapshot of the thwartive defensive procedure, explore sensation to its intended and meaningful completion. So what did you want to do in that memory? Did you want to fight? Did you want to run away? What did you need to do? And step 5 is resetting of core regulatory system, restoring balance, equilibrium, and relaxed alertness. So really almost there, just reorienting to the environment. So step 6 is the procedural memories are linked to emotional, episodic, and narrative memory, and it takes its rightful place in the past. The traumatic procedural memories are no longer being reactivated in their incomplete and maladaptive form. So that would be like triggers, and you're getting it triggered, and the response is coming up, this procedure, where it shouldn't be activated. And so now that form, that maladaptive form, is now transformed as empowered, healthy agency and triumph. The entire procedure has been changed and allows for updated emotional and episodic memory. So, wow, that's really, that's an interesting perspective. So it's really about renegotiating. It's going back into the memory, doing what you felt you needed to do, and then reintegrating that into your memory and to your autobiographical memory and with narrative. A key feature is to visit your procedural memory incrementally with the most recent first. Timing of renegotiation is key. It's possible to reinforce traumatic memory and be re-traumatized. Again, if you're getting overwhelmed. Another important reason to have a proper therapist. But when done correctly, we embody triumph and we weave the traumatic memory back into the tapestry of our lives in its proper place in the past. The third book, In an Unspoken Voice, How the Body Releases Trauma and Restores Goodness. This is Dr. Levine's ultimate book after decades of practice. And it's really great. There's a huge amount of insights in here. And he's just more candid in the way he speaks about it. Trauma is not an incurable disorder or disease, but dis-ease. It's about bringing safety back into the body. Shaking, quivering, trembling, and deep, spontaneous breathing is key to recovering from trauma. Trembling can be unobserved and result in temperature changes. This is gamma movement. It resets the nervous system. Freezing isn't bad, but immobility with great fear or negative emotion leads to trauma and traumatic symptoms. Decoupling negative emotionality with freezing is key to breaking free and moving through immobility. We must be able to tolerate intense emotionality, which allows us to reach self-paced termination of immobility. By tolerating the intense emotionality, we can still work through the self-paced termination of immobility. When we're immobilized, it's supposed to be for a certain length of time and then stop. Our bodies tell threat both internally and externally. Much of hypervigilance, constantly searching for threats, comes from an internal lack of safety. Our feelings, especially trauma, are often visceral. We feel it in our guts. And anxiety can come from constricted blood vessels in our guts. From our guts to our brain, there's a 9-to-1 communication. Most of it's coming from the bottom up. Something I found very interesting in Dr. Levine's finding was a sound which can bring us back to our bodies. The sound is VOO, V-O-O. So breathe in deeply, and with the exhale sound, VOO, all the way out like a foghorn, like a ship coming to shore. VOO unknots the gut and affects the afferent nerve for socializing and being in the here and now. This goes back to chanting as well. So instead of Om, this would be VOO. There are 4 channels of sensation, interoception, in increasing depth. The first channel is kinesthetic. This is the tension of the muscles and the stretch receptors. The second is proprioception. This is the positions of the joints and where we are with velocity. There's vestibular, and this is the balancing of the ear. So the microscopic hairs in the ear canal, which help for balance and velocity as well. And finally, there's the visceral feeling. That's the viscera and blood vessels, so all the organs of the body. Trauma creates narrow, constricted, fixed meanings and beliefs. Dr. Levine's SIBAM model is used to update meaning. SIBAM stands for sensations, images, behavior, affect, and meaning. Sensations are the interoception of the 4 channels we just discussed. Image is the sensory impression we get from our senses. so sight, sound, taste, touch. Behavior are the observable actions and noticeable nervous system changes, something we actually display. Affect are emotions and felt experience. Meaning are the words we use to describe the previous four. So triggers can occur at each level of SIBAM. During a traumatic event, some sensations or emotions can be overemphasized, while others are underemphasized. A somatic experiencing therapist guides the client through the SIBAM model to follow their sensations and complete the trauma response. The action pattern. Their body wanted to follow to release the energy. Instinct energy goes to thought, but can cause fantasy, delusion, rumination, and excessive worry. The solution is to be fully present. Intuition is joining the bodily sensation with thinking and pictures. The best way to handle a trigger is to stop it at the start. A trigger initiates a maladaptive instinct. Once we begin the procedural memory, we are in the expressive phase. We need to extinguish the spark before the flame, the preconscious initiation of action. Become aware of the pre-movement before it becomes a movement sequence. Now, the way that that's described makes it sound easy. It is incredibly difficult, but again, this is also about developing a felt sense, really being in touch and in tune with your body, really being aware. We see that somatic experiencing therapy is promising in many ways, but it is dangerous to do on our own at risk of re-traumatizing ourselves. It greatly helps to have a somatic experiencing healer who can recognize our bodily states and guide us through the stages of healing. Of course, so much of this depends on growing our interoception, noticing and tolerating the feelings of our bodies. Meditation and yoga of course help, but Dr. Levine offers many exercises throughout his books. One of the most effective exercises to do is with a pulsating shower head. A common sign of trauma is loss of sensitivity in the skin. We can reconnect with our bodies by having the pulsing water on an area like the neck and saying, "This is my neck," while feeling the sensation. Repeat for each body part. Something you can do every day is to clench and release your fist while being closely mindful for 10 minutes. A funner one is to go through a picture book or images and pause to see how an image makes you feel in your body. Something else you can look into is tension and trauma releasing exercises by Dr. David Verselli. They have books and an app. I don't think this is endorsed by Dr. Levine, but it's a similar somatic release therapy that's supposed to get you shaking off the trauma. I haven't tried this or read the book, I just saw it and I thought it was worth including. Bessel van der Kolk, Peter Levine, and Judith Herman are the three big names in trauma. Judith Herman coined the term and wrote the book on complex trauma, called Trauma and Recovery: The Aftermath of Violence, from Domestic Abuse to Political Terror. Dr. Herman goes into the history of trauma. Interestingly, there isn't much medical work talking about trauma or traumatic symptoms in history. PTSD became official in the 80s. The work gave me an entirely new respect for the sexism women have faced throughout history, as women suffered violence and PTSD similar to combat soldiers. Society silenced women who often dealt with rape is perceived by women as life-threatening while fearing mutilation and death. The initial feminist movement was just trying to get us all to agree that rape is really bad. Feminists redefined rape as atrocious violence. This led to the investigation of domestic battery, intimate partner rape, child abuse, and other private coercion. Trauma generally involves threats to life or bodily integrity, or a close personal encounter with violence and death. The common denominator is feelings of intense fear, helplessness, and threat of annihilation. Likelihood of trauma increases with being trapped, taken by surprise, or taken to the point of exhaustion. Trauma causes an overwhelm and dysfunction of normal reactions. A trauma victim may not remember the details of the event, but have powerful emotions. Conversely, a victim may remember everything in detail, but without emotion. PTSD has 3 categories: hyperarousal, intrusion, and constriction. Traumatic symptoms take on a life of their own and disconnect from the original event. Hyperarousal involves being easily startled, irritable, and trouble sleeping. Intrusion symptoms can be reliving the event as if it's continually recurring in the present, abnormal form of memory, triggers, and recurring dreams. Constriction can be the freeze state, a state of surrender, or numbing. Victims alternate between amnesia and flashbacks. Traumatic events have primary effects on attachment to self and meaning. Traumatized people struggle to connect with others and their community while struggling to find meaning and purpose. A secure sense of connection with caring people is the foundation of personality development. We lose connection with self when this is broken. That sense can only be rebuilt as it was formed through relationships of safety and protection. Recognition and restitution are important for a sense of order and justice. Trauma is different for everyone, dependent on factors such as childhood development, emotional conflicts, and adaptive style. Here are some resiliency traits: alert, active temperament, sociability, unusual skill in communicating, and belief in affecting one's destiny, an internal locus of control. During stressful events, they find an opportunity for purposeful action. There's a chapter devoted to captivity, not only prisoners of war, but domestic battery. People in captivity experience prolonged and multiple traumatic events. Chronic trauma leads to terrible symptoms such as flashbacks, insomnia, nightmares, and an autonomic nervous system that has forgotten a baseline of calm. Severe trauma symptoms make the person believe their body has turned against them. Trauma causes a sense of, I am a different person. But the severely traumatized believe, I am not a person. Interestingly, pair bonding seems to be the basic unit of survival. 2 people. There's an entire chapter on child abuse. Children's reactions are to maintain attachment to parents. Defense mechanisms can include denial, amnesia, dissociation, minimization, rationalization, and excuses. Dissociation can become an automatic reaction and affect personality formation, resulting in a fragmented self. This is where alters or other personalities can come from. When dissociation fails, children can believe they are bad and deserving of punishment to give meaning to the abuse. An inner view of a malignant bad core continues to adulthood. There's a gender difference in violence. Men are more likely to fight and harm. Women are more likely to be victimized and self-harm. Defensive strategies often break down in the 3rd or 4th decade of life. Brilliant strategies of survival in childhood unravel in freedom and adulthood. The fragmentation becomes manifest. This quote really stood out to me. I just love it. The phoenix goes down into the fire with the best intention of rising, then falters on the upswing. The major contribution of Dr. Herman's work is a proposed diagnosis of complex PTSD for sufferers of prolonged or repeated traumas. The ongoing nature of the trauma results in different symptoms than a single event PTSD. CPTSD sufferers are often misdiagnosed within the mental health care system for quite some time before getting to the underlying trauma. So PTSD, they fear they've lost their minds. CPTSD, they fear they've lost themselves. Part 2 of the book describes the 4 stages of recovery. Stage 1 is a healing relationship. Typically, this is with a therapist. Stage 2 is developing safety. Trauma robs us of power and control. The first task is to establish safety in self, then the environment. Self-destructive behaviors take many forms and are a serious danger. A common error is the belief that to retell the trauma story in full detail will bring a cathartic cure. The traumatic memory uncovering often takes place in smaller pieces after establishing safety. There are numerous risks in the therapy relationship. The next stage is remembrance and mourning. We must reconstruct the traumatic event in time and historical context. As the narrative comes to the most unbearable moments, the person may use nonverbal communication. Remembrance comes down to one question: why? Then, why me? The traumatized person is challenged to construct a belief system that makes sense of the undeserved suffering. We must develop a tolerance for uncertainty and ambiguity. Often, the memories and sensations are so traumatic they are put behind an amnesia wall. There are many techniques for recovering memories. The simplest is exploring memories already conscious. Breaking through the amnesia wall is far less difficult than integrating what's on the other side into a life narrative. Resistance to mourning and grief is the biggest cause of stagnation in stage 2. Held up by thoughts of revenge, forgiveness, or compensation. The revenge fantasy is often a mirror image of the traumatic event. The victim taking the place of the perpetrator. Revenge is a wish for catharsis, that the person can get rid of the terror, rage, and pain by retaliating against the perpetrator. Revenge also arises out of complete helplessness. In humiliated fury, the victim imagines revenge is the only way to restore the sense of power and to force the perpetrator to acknowledge the harm done. Repetitive revenge fantasies often increase symptoms and are as violent, arousing, and intrusive as the traumatic memories. They also make the victim feel like a monster. It is highly frustrating, as revenge can never make up for what was done. People who actually commit revenge often have the worst chronic PTSD symptoms. The solution is righteous indignation. The polar opposite of a revenge fantasy is a fantasy of forgiveness, which is an attempt to regain power. The wish to ascend from rage and trauma through a willed and defiant act of love. It is not possible to undo trauma with hatred or love of the perpetrator. True forgiveness cannot be granted until the perpetrator has sought and earned it through confession, repentance, and restitution, which is a rare miracle. Another type is compensation. Compensation may be a defense against facing the full reality of what was lost. Mourning is the best way to face loss. There is no adequate compensation for this loss. Compensation is fueled by the desire to erase humiliation of trauma and have victory over the perpetrator. The major issue is that this ties the fate of recovery to the perpetrator. We can be liberated if we don't rely on hope of compensation. Demand for compensation can be from the perpetrator, bystanders, or society. The survivor is not responsible for the traumatic event, but is responsible for recovery. This is the beginning of empowerment. We must find a way to mourn in the present. Mourning does not last forever, and eventually, trauma will fade with other memories. Trauma loses the central place in your life. Time begins to move again. The final stage is reconnection. Having come to terms with trauma and loss of self, the survivor must build a new self and new relationships. We must reestablish an agenda, aspirations, and ambitions. Helplessness and isolation are the core experience of psychological trauma. Empowerment and reconnection are the core experiences of recovery. Particularly powerful recovery involves a survivor mission and social action like being an advocate for other victims. Resolution is never final. Recovery is never complete. Trauma can reverberate throughout the survivor's life cycle. Mary Harvey defines 7 criteria for the resolution of trauma. So when you have these 7, you're really making progress. Number 1, the psychological symptoms of PTSD have been brought within manageable limits. 2, the person is able to bear the feelings associated with the traumatic memories. 3, The person has authority over their memories. They can elect to both remember the trauma and put those memories aside. 4, the memory of the traumatic event is a coherent narrative linked with feeling. 5, the person's damaged self-esteem has been restored. 6, the person's important relationships have been reestablished. And 7, the person has reconstructed a coherent system of meaning and belief that encompasses the story of the trauma. The course of recovery does not follow a simple progression, but often detours and doubles back, reviewing issues that have already been addressed many times, in order to deepen and expand the survivor's integration of the meaning of their experience. Okay, now I have a question. Why aren't trauma and healing more well known? Why isn't this taught in school or common knowledge? Dr. Herman's answer blew me away. There's trauma we can relate to, which are often natural disasters, weather events, a car accident, etc. But there's a much more difficult trauma in person-to-person and institutional harm. Trauma is often associated with oppressed people, so it is politicized. The oppressors causing trauma want to minimize and deny the harm done. All they ask is that you see, hear, and speak no evil. However, the oppressed asked for empathy, compassion, and understanding. It's much easier on the rest of us not to connect. The study of trauma will continually be hidden and rediscovered. Well, here we are on another Friday night. This next resource is something I found from comments on YouTube pointing to this person. It's Tim Fletcher, Complex Trauma and Addiction. I'll link to his channel. Tim Fletcher is a Canadian pastor who runs a program treating complex trauma and addiction. I found his channel recommended in some comments on other trauma videos, and his series really opened my mind. There's a distinction made in the trauma field about big T trauma and little t trauma. Big T trauma is associated with PTSD. It is an event outside of normal experience which causes an extreme sense of danger, a lack of safety. However, little t trauma can be any event which causes a lack of safety. Chronic little t trauma can develop into complex trauma. A lot of this relates to our development and relationship to caregivers. Our parents may have taken care of us physically and educationally, but neglected or even threatened our emotional needs. Complex trauma can add up even if we don't recognize it. Tim is big on reparenting ourselves to heal trauma and taking care of our 12 needs. His videos help to identify and understand complex trauma. Tim gives 5 phases to healing CPTSD. Phase 1 is tools to de-escalate dysregulated emotions, so grounding techniques. He talks about rhythms, so music, walking, tapping, such as the emotional freedom technique, drawing, counting, breathing. The cortex at this stage, if you're dysregulated, it is not available initially. Phase 2, once regulated and the cortex is back online, we reprocess the event, what was triggered, and learn from it. Phase 3 is tools for an increasingly healthy stress response system. So yoga, running, pet therapy, art therapy. We need to learn to meet our 12 needs, and we need to connect to healthy people. Phase 4 is healing deep trauma wounds. A trigger is an unhealed trauma wound being poked. Phase 5 is mindfulness. It's interoception of emotions and mental states. How can you improve your mental state or emotional state if it's not good? Curiosity. Don't judge yourself, but be curious what wound was triggered. By following these 5 phases, which they're laid out simply, but it does take a lot of work, this will hopefully eventually heal much of their CPTSD. So he gives talks and has PowerPoints. There's something about the presentation that draws me in. Maybe I miss pastors. Something I really appreciate is he splits up the information on complex trauma with the sermon on how it relates to something in the Bible. Just about every episode, he has something relating to the Bible, but he always says If this isn't something you're interested in, you can go no problem. And I almost always stop watching. So he runs some recovery program you can buy into, but there's so much helpful information that he puts out there for free. Something related to this in complex trauma and addiction, I'd also point out that there's Dr. Gabor Mate. In particular for addiction, Dr. Gabor Mate is well known for trauma and addiction. I watched an interesting lecture by Dr. Mate on the relationship between stress, inflammation, and disease. Stress and trauma can cause chronic inflammation, which leads to disease. So experiencing psychological trauma can lead to disease. This is another resource if this is your particular issue. Complex PTSD by Pete Walker and the Tao of Fully Feeling. You can read more about Pete Walker on his website, which has quite a few articles freely available at pete-walker.com. I'm certain there are mind blowers for almost everyone in this book. I recommend finding the contents and reading through it. Walker defines CPTSD as a more severe form of PTSD and draws on the work of Judith Herman. Some of the symptoms are emotional flashbacks, toxic shame, self-abandonment, a vicious inner critic, and social anxiety. Emotional flashbacks are most notable of CPTSD. Flashbacks are the inner child crying for help. Walker calls these feelings the abandonment melange, the depressive and other negative feelings from early childhood abandonment and abuse. Walker has 13 steps to manage emotional flashbacks on his website. Part of why this book is so great is because Walker puts into words what can be strongly emotionally felt, but you might not have a description for. So, toxic shame is blame unfairly directed at the self. Shame at a very young age can be toxic and result in something called soul murder, where we deeply repress essential parts of ourselves. A mind blower for me is how we are mothered relates to our self-compassion. How we are fathered relates to our self-protection. Babies are entitled to unconditional love in the first 2 years of life. A lack of this can result in CPTSD. It's up to us as individuals to supply our inner childs with unconditional love, which is reparenting. Self-mothering helps to heal the wounds of neglect. Self-fathering helps in assertiveness against abuse, both internal and external. Walker points out the importance of our relationship to food. Eating is one of the first ways we learn to soothe ourselves. Food activates the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest. Food activates the parasympathetic nervous system, rest and digest, to counter the sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight. We can rely on this too much. People with CPTSD can focus too much on diet, believing if they just had the right diet, their unpleasant symptoms would go away. Walker recommends focusing on diet later and instead working on core issues related to trauma. Finding the perfect diet is a salvation fantasy. But I think I'm really close to the perfect diet. All right. I didn't like to hear it, but Walker says we need to give up on the idea of ideal salvation, that we can quickly or 100% be cured of CPTSD. We need to accept that recovery is a lifelong progression. There are many temporary regressions. However, the silver lining is survivors of CPTSD can develop emotional intelligence beyond the norm with greater intimacy. While we've seen the 4 F's of survival before, I didn't know how they played out as entrenched defensive structures in personality development. We gravitate to one or more of these defenses to survive. But a fight defense leads to narcissism. A flight defense can lead to obsessive-compulsive disorder. A freeze response can lead to dissociation, and fawning to codependency. Each response has a healthy use, and we should be able to employ all of them flexibly. However, over-reliance on 1 or 2 responses plays out in a number of ways. They affect our attachment style. When we're in attachment, a fight will control to connect and rage to be safe. A flight type will perfect to connect and perfect to be safe. A freeze type, no way out to connect, hide to be safe. Fawning is merge to connect, grovel to be safe. Walker offers paths for recovery from each type. Particularly interesting to me was the relation between flight and freeze types of dissociation, left brain and right brain dissociation. Flight types flee their feelings by constantly doing and thinking. Freeze types can disconnect by fantasizing and often fall into daydreaming, online browsing, and video games. Walker has a whole chapter on fawn codependency type, as that is his personal experience and specialty. The 4 types are on a continuum from mild to extreme. There are also hybrid trauma types, fight fawn, fight freeze, flight freeze, etc. The descriptions of some of these were so accurate, my jaw was dropping. Like, forget astrology and horoscopes, what's your trauma response? Another critical aspect of CPTSD is the critic, both inner and outer. A vicious or sadistic inner critic destroys our self-esteem, punishes us, and is the inner projection of our parents. The outer critic attacks our relationships as an attempt to protect us from the pain of abandonment and danger we expect from our early relationships. Each 4F type has different ratios for inner and outer critics. Triggering the inner critic can trigger fear and shame, which triggers one of the 4F responses. Shrinking the inner critic is done at the cognitive level. Grieving is essential to healing. There are 4 steps: angering, crying, verbal ventilating, and feeling. Grieving expands insight and understanding. We must lovingly care for self when in emotional flashbacks. We must grieve the death of early attachment needs. Grieving ameliorates flashbacks, and the inner critic can stop grieving. So we need to shrink the inner critic. And we can defuel the inner critic by grieving. Angering, it diminishes fear and shame and helps to deconstruct the repetition compulsion. Crying helps to soothe fear. Crying and anger can go together. It's best to anger and cry during a flashback to release. We can see gender stereotypes stop this. Men are allowed to be angry but not cry. Women are allowed to cry but not express anger. Verbal ventilation is speaking while focusing on feelings. It keeps our cognitive perspective while experiencing emotion. It develops new neural pathways for thinking and feeling. And it can heal crucial developmental arrest. Feeling. Be present with our feelings and energetic affects. We gently absorb and metabolize feelings into our experience. It's different from emoting, which is acting on emotions in the previous 3 steps. The keys we see are anger, self-assertiveness, and setting boundaries, grief, deep sorrow over recognition of loss, and feeling with mindful awareness. Internal Family Systems Therapy by Richard Schwartz. Out of all the things I've read, I felt like I was missing something. I have to say that IFS provided a framework that gave me a major breakthroughs. At first, I was distrusting because it can get weird, but it's an interesting alternative perspective on trauma and healing. You can watch videos by Dr. Schwartz explaining the discovery of IFS by working with insightful patients. Originally, family systems therapy worked with a family as a system, and each member of the family was a part playing roles. The change was seeing that each individual had an internal family in their mind. The essential nature of our mind is plurality of parts. It's like multiple personality disorder with alter egos. Those people are just an extreme case, as will be explained. A healthy person has open communication between parts. We hear this language in people, especially when there's a conflict, like a part of me wants to go, a part of me wants to stay. Here's the framework. The idea is that we have a core sense of self, but we also have other supporting parts, such as managers, firefighters, and exiles. A central idea is that everyone has a core sense of self, which they call a capital S self. This self is similar to the Buddha nature seen in Buddhism. The self is supposed to be the leader in the hierarchy of our internal family system. When the other parts step back, the self reveals its essential nature of 8 C's and 5 P's. When this happens, the self can automatically heal and harmonize. The role of the IFS therapist is to help along this natural healing process by embodying self-energy. The 8 C's of self are calm, confidence, connected, creativity, compassion, curiosity, courage, and clarity. The 5 P's are presence, perspective, patience, playfulness, persistence. There are also other things like forgiveness, but apparently it's just nice to stick to the 8 C's and 5 P's. Our self can lose leadership if the other parts lose trust. A part besides the self in leadership is a pathology, but each is important in its role. Managers and firefighters are protectors. Managers are proactive. Firefighters are reactive. Exiles are analogous to Carl Jung's shadow. They're the parts of us which we don't want to feel in consciousness. Exiles hold the hurt trauma burdened us with, the extreme emotions or beliefs. So managers are responsible for running the show in the day-to-day. They manage time, plan ahead, and want to control. They are the inner and outer critic. They suppress exiles. When the manager's defenses fail and exiles break through, the firefighters react. Think of actual firefighters who hose away a raging fire. Exiles get triggered and want to be seen, heard, and healed. But firefighters are afraid their strong emotions or beliefs will destabilize the system. Firefighters think in the short term, put out the fire now using whatever means necessary. They can use substances, distractions, or whatever works to hold the system in check. When all else fails, the last defense is to stop the suffering. So the healing process in IFS is a bit different. They break it up into connecting with your protector parts. So first dealing with the managers or firefighters, and then getting to the exile that they're protecting. And the goal is to depolarize protectors while also healing and unburdening the exile. There are 6 F's to working with protectors, which is to find the protector, focus on them, flesh out, feel towards, befriend, and to know their fears. Why are they protecting these exiles? What are they afraid will happen if the exile is brought to consciousness? Once you befriend and understand the protectors, what their role is, why they're being protective, then you can move on to healing the exiled part. And this would be to witness what the exile went through, to reparent them if necessary, to retrieve them out of the situation that they're in, to unburden them of that intense survival and traumatic energy, and to reintegrate them into the system. When we work with one protector and get behind them, sometimes there's another burden protector or an exile. Retrieval can mean finding a new role for the part, inviting good qualities, or it can be kept in the past in a safer, renegotiated setting. The unburdening is the release of the life-saving energy from trauma. What's so interesting about IFS are the similarities and differences to other trauma therapies. IFS is non-pathologizing. Listen to this. There is no bad part of you. Every part is working towards the health of the whole, but they can be misguided. The substance abuse, the self-harm, the suicidal ideation, the overeating, they're all trying to protect you. You can unburden those parts and bring them back to a healthier and truly protective role. This is a totally different perspective from when we feel we are at war with ourselves, like there's a part of us we need to cut out or dominate. In other therapies, when we feel traumatic symptoms coming on, we might start with grounding techniques like stomping our feet. In IFS, this is really telling an exile you don't want it around or to witness it. Instead, IFS believes that if we embody self-energy, we can fully experience any emotion without being overwhelmed. Additionally, IFS cautions against use of EMDR and psychedelics because they can allow access to exiled parts without protectors' permission. This throws off the delicate balance we have of our inner system. This style of thinking brought me a lot more peace and understanding. I highly recommend Dr. Tori Old's explanations, as they made even more sense to me than listening to the book or watching the videos by Dr. Schwartz. You can also look into schema therapy. And if this helps, there's also Lucas Frostmeyer as another IFS therapist. Polyvagal Theory by Stephen Porges. This isn't a book I've read, but the literature points to the work a lot. The idea is to stimulate the higher mammalian brain structure of the vagus nerve. Evolutionarily more recent than fight or flight, the vagus is a cranial nerve that allows for social engagement and a pathway for both attentive arousal and calm. You can find lots of videos on how to directly stimulate the vagus nerve through pressure points and postures. You'll know it's working when you sigh, swallow, or yawn. The emotional freedom technique. This is a technique you can do daily to release some stored energy. There's a whole therapy around tapping, which has roots in somatic therapy and indigenous healing. Dr. Levine noted that a common symptom of trauma is loss in skin sensitivity. In tapping, we reestablish feeling in the body, in the present, and the boundaries between ourselves and the external world. When we tap alternatively, we increase bilateral communication between the two halves of our brain, improving integration. The best video I've seen on EFT comes from Therapy in a Nutshell. Emma McAdam has a ton of great videos on all kinds of topics. Another great one is building cognitive diffusion, getting distance from our thoughts. It can be as simple as, I am thinking that, instead of immediately being swept up in our thoughts. So I highly recommend that channel. EMDR, Eye Movement Desensitization Reintegration. It's an adjunct therapy. I mentioned EMDR early. The results of EMDR really impressed Bessel van der Kolk. EMDR helps to calm the nervous system and see traumatic events clearly with perspective. At a basic level, you move your eyes from left to right, back and forth, while recalling the trauma and work your way through it. Of course, it can be more complicated with alternating lights, tapping, vibrations. And it sounds simple, but why is it so powerful? Well, during REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, your eyes are moving left to right while your brain consolidates the memories of the day. We are consciously invoking this consolidation when we copy the eye movement pattern while awake. Remember, trauma is a dissociated or disconnected memory, which we want to integrate in our mind. Additionally, while walking, our eyes are moving across the environment slowly from left to right. When we speed up this eye movement, our brain could be getting the signal that we are moving forward. In trauma, we often feel stuck in a moment, but this signal allows us to move forward past the trauma. We're able to experience what happens next. This therapy is most useful for PTSD or one traumatic event. CPTSD tends to be more difficult. Conclusion and summary is, trauma is a hurt we carry in the present. Trauma is a memory not in its proper place in the past. Trauma is an event we perceive as overwhelming. We must change and expand our perception to process the trauma. Every trauma is valid. Dangerous experiences are potentially traumatic. We can go through an experience with someone right next to us, and they won't be traumatized. That doesn't make our traumatic reaction any less justified. Trauma is highly personal and based on our bodies and previous experiences. We see similarities among methods of healing. The common thread is that we must be in tune with our bodies. We cannot disconnect and heal at the same time. Healing typically has 3 stages. Number 1 is establishing safety both internally and externally. You need to tolerate your bodily sensations. Feel both the ease and dis-ease in your body. Your environment should be relatively safe so your body and mind can relax. With safety, you can have regulation, which is key to having your body and mind functioning normally to heal. Step 2 is to live through the traumatic memory. You must relive the trauma while fully experiencing and releasing your feelings and bodily sensations. You must cognitively process what happened with a beginning, middle, and end. Recognize that you survived. This is the most dangerous part because we are at risk of becoming overwhelmed again and re-traumatized. Sometimes the energy of our feelings are so intense, we will need to do this stage multiple times and in parts, steadily increasing our level of tolerance as we process. The most common feelings of trauma are terror and rage. Terror is thwarted fear. Rage is thwarted anger. We need to bring down those levels to expressible fear and anger. Sometimes there are parts of us that decide, never again. Never again will I feel that way, whether in memory or in the future. A part of healing is to have a healthy defense against what you experienced. Healing from trauma means more awareness of and being better able to defend against those threats. We don't always have to relive the trauma as it was. Often there is a kind of renegotiation. When we relive the trauma, we live through it, meaning we decide and act through it. We do what we wanted and needed during the trauma that we were prevented or unable to do. This is not a denial of what happened, but a release of the overwhelming, life-saving energy we had stored. We can recognize this is the path to healing the present and the future. Finally, there is reintegration and reconnection. We are embodied, we are present. We are able to respond to stress in healthy ways. We are reconnected to ourselves and the environment. The traumatic memory doesn't have the hold over us it used to. It has taken its proper place in the past. Unfortunately, it's easier for children to become traumatized. Kids can more easily be overwhelmed. Especially before the age of 2.5 years, our minds are more like a traumatized state, wordless, formless. How can we cognitively place a traumatic event during those times? Developmental trauma leads to complex PTSD, which is much more difficult to heal. We need to be our own good parent and nurture that hurt inner child in us. Healing is very difficult, but so is living with trauma. Trauma can be an open wound or a neglected scar. The more we heal, the more resilient and fully alive we can be. I expected to hear more about post-traumatic growth theory in these books. Some researchers described 4 possibilities of adversity: succumbing to adversity, surviving with diminished quality of life, resiliency, returning to a baseline quality of life, and thriving, where thriving is enhanced quality of life. As unbelievable as it may sound, I hope you can strive for thriving. This has been a lot for me, but this was my starting point where I've been. I really hope that this gives you something of value, and please let me know if there's anything else I should read or what else I should look into. But thank you for your time.